The coroner ruled it a homicide. The doctor was convicted of manslaughter, and his fans, to this day, call it something else entirely. Something closer to murder by an entire industry that needed him on a stage whether his body could handle it or not. He was the most famous human being who had ever lived. He sold more records than anyone in history. He owned a music catalog worth billions, and he spent the last years of his life quietly telling the people closest to him that someone was going to kill him for it. And almost nobody outside his inner circle took it seriously. Today we're doing a full deep dive into the life and death of Michael Jackson, and I promise you, even if you think you know the story, there's a lot buried in here that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. So let's get into it. The story starts in Gary, Indiana, a steel town on the southern shore of Lake Michigan that existed, in the most literal sense, to feed the mills. And Joseph Jackson, born in 1928 in rural Arkansas, moved north chasing the same promise that pulled thousands of black families into the region during the Great Migration. And he became a crane operator. And in his off hours, he played guitar in a blues band called the Falcons that never landed a record deal. And that failure mattered more than anyone realized at the time, because Joe folded up that dream and redirected it with what his own children would later describe as ferocious, sometimes brutal precision, straight into them. Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, the seventh living child in a two-bedroom house that was already bursting at the seams. And when Joe discovered his son, Tito, secretly playing his forbidden guitar, instead of punishing him, he bought him a real one. And what followed was the formation of a family band run with the discipline of a military unit. And Michael, only 6 years old when he joined, wasn't even the lead singer at first. That job belonged to his older brother Jermaine. But even as a backup dancer, something about the youngest Jackson was visibly, unmistakably different. He studied James Brown on television with the focus of a graduate student. And by 1967, at just 8 years old, his voice had developed a quality Jermaine simply didn't have, an ability to inhabit a lyric's emotion with an almost unsettling adult conviction. So Joe made the call. Michael became the lead singer, and that same year, the Jackson 5 won amateur night at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, one of the most notoriously unforgiving stages in American entertainment. Motown signed them in 1968, and the machine began to turn. And what happened next has almost no real parallel in music history. I Want You Back hit number 1 in January 1970, then ABC in April, then The Love You Save in June, and then I'll Be There in October. 4 consecutive number 1 singles in 9 months, and Michael Jackson was 11 years old, the youngest artist to ever top the Billboard chart. The Jackson 5 had arrived in California as unknowns and left 1970 as the biggest act in popular music. And at the center of every performance, drawing every eye, was an 11-year-old boy singing about heartbreak he'd never personally experienced, with a conviction that made you forget he was a child at all. Here's where it's worth pausing, because the pattern that would define the rest of Michael Jackson's life was already visible before he was even a teenager. A childhood spent almost entirely inside a machine built for adult stardom. Talent shows, then arenas, then Saturday morning cartoons, then, by 12 years old, a mansion in the San Fernando Valley. And somewhere in that acceleration, an actual childhood, the ordinary, boring, unsupervised kind, simply never happened. The solo career took off alongside the group, and in 1979, at 21 years old, Jackson released Off the Wall with producer Quincy Jones, an album so sophisticated it functioned as adult music made by someone who sounded twice his age. It sold over 20 million copies and won a Grammy. But it didn't win Album of the Year, and people close to Jackson said that loss stung him in a way that went beyond disappointment. He told them the next album would be so big nobody could ignore it, and he meant it. What he made next was Thriller, recorded through 1982 on a budget of $750,000. Expensive for the era, but modest for what it became. It spent 37 non-consecutive weeks at number 1. It was the best-selling album of both 1983 and 1984. All 7 of its singles hit the top 10. And its total sales, estimated at 70 million copies worldwide, remain a figure no other album has ever approached. And the cultural machinery around it was just as revolutionary as the music. MTV, still overwhelmingly programming white rock acts, initially declined to air the Billie Jean video, until CBS Records president reportedly threatened to pull all CBS content from the network entirely. The video that followed effectively integrated MTV. Then came the moment that turned Michael Jackson from a superstar into something without a real name. On May 16, 1983, at the Motown 25th anniversary special, watched by roughly 47 million people, Jackson performed Billie Jean and, in a single fluid backward glide lasting maybe 6 or 7 seconds, executed the moonwalk on live television for the first time. Fred Astaire reportedly called him the next morning. And in that one motion, Michael Jackson crossed from stardom into something the culture had no adequate word for yet. Less than a year later, on January 27, 1984, While filming a Pepsi commercial, pyrotechnics ignited too close to his head and his hair caught fire, leaving him with second-degree burns to his scalp. He was treated and released, and he donated part of the settlement to a burn center that renamed itself in his honor. It looked, at the time, like a footnote. It wasn't. To manage the pain from the burn and the reconstructive surgeries that followed, Jackson was prescribed opioid painkillers, and nearly everyone close to him would later point to this exact moment as the beginning of a pharmaceutical dependency that never fully let go of him for the rest of his life. His body, it turns out, had already begun quietly working against him in other ways, too. In 1983, a Beverly Hills dermatologist named Dr. Arnold Klein diagnosed him with lupus, an autoimmune condition. And 3 years later, the same doctor delivered a second diagnosis, vitiligo, a condition in which the immune system attacks the cells that produce skin pigment, leaving irregular patches of depigmentation across the body. For any person, that's a difficult diagnosis. For the most photographed black man on the planet, whose changing appearance was already tabloid fuel, it was catastrophic. Jackson wouldn't publicly disclose the vitiligo until a 1993 interview with Oprah Winfrey, watched by 90 million people, and by then, years of cruel speculation had already calcified into a narrative about self-hatred that his own autopsy 16 years later would definitively prove wrong. In 1985, between Thriller and his next album, Jackson made the financial decision that would define the rest of his life. Paul McCartney had explained to him during their collaborations together that owning music publishing rights was where the real money lived. So when the ATV catalog, roughly 4,000 songs including 251 Lennon-McCartney compositions, came up for sale, Jackson pursued it aggressively and closed the deal for $47.5 million. McCartney, who had wanted the catalog himself, was reportedly furious, and the friendship never recovered. By the time of Jackson's death, that catalog was valued at roughly $1 billion. It made him extraordinarily wealthy on paper. It also, according to people who knew him, made him a target, and he would spend his final years telling people someone was going to kill him for it. Bad, released in 1987, sold over 35 million copies, and generated a record 5 consecutive #1 singles from a single album. And in January 1993, Jackson headlined the Super Bowl halftime show, the first music superstar to ever do so, permanently transforming the halftime slot from a bathroom break afterthought into the premier live performance event in American entertainment. By the mid-1990s, Michael Jackson had sold more records than any solo artist in history. He'd invented the modern music video. He'd integrated MTV. He owned the most valuable music publishing catalog on Earth. And he was, by virtually any measure, the most famous person alive. And then it all started to come apart. His closest friendships tell you something about who he actually needed around him. Elizabeth Taylor, who he met in the mid-1980s, became his fiercest defender, and their friendship lasted over 25 years until her death in 2011. As two people who had grown up inside fame's distortion field before they understood who they even were. His romantic life, by contrast, was brief and intense and endlessly scrutinized. He married Lisa Marie Presley, daughter of Elvis, in 1994, 20 days after her divorce was finalized, and the world treated it as a publicity stunt designed to rehabilitate his image. Presley would insist for the rest of her life that it was real, but it ended within 2 years. His second marriage, to Debbie Rowe, produced his first 2 children, Prince and Paris, and by Rowe's own later description, was closer to an arrangement built around his desire to become a father than a conventional relationship. His third child, Prince Michael II, nicknamed Blanket, was born via surrogate in 2002, and the identity of that surrogate has never been publicly confirmed. In 1988, Jackson purchased the property that would come to define his public mythology more than any album, Neverland Ranch, 2,700 acres in the Santa Ynez Valley, built into something between a private theme park and a living fairy tale, complete with a Ferris wheel, a zoo, and a movie theater. He named it after the island where children never grow up, and the symbolism wasn't subtle. Jackson identified with Peter Pan openly and repeatedly. He saw childhood as something sacred that had been stolen from him, and Neverland became his refuge, his creative workspace, and eventually the setting of the allegations that nearly destroyed him. In 1992, a woman named June Chandler and her 13-year-old son Jordan entered Jackson's orbit through a chance connection, and Jackson took to the boy with an intensity that people around him had, by then, learned to recognize as a pattern. Close relationships with children, usually boys around 12 or 13, marked by constant phone calls, invitations to Neverland, and a generosity toward the whole family that bordered on compulsive. To Jackson, by his own account, these relationships were innocent, an attempt to live inside the childhood he felt had been taken from him. To outside observers, they were at best deeply unusual and at worst alarming. Jordan's father, Evan Chandler, a dentist who had not been part of the initial relationship, grew suspicious, and then something harder to categorize. In a recorded phone call from July 1993, he was heard saying that if he went through with pursuing this, He would win big and destroy Jackson forever. That recording remains one of the most fought-over pieces of evidence in the entire case. To Jackson's defenders, it's proof the whole thing was a shakedown dressed up as child protection. To those who believed the allegations, it's a father's anguished calculation about legal leverage, not evidence the underlying claims were false. Both readings are sustainable. Neither is definitive. Formal allegations were reported that August and 2 separate grand juries in Los Angeles and Santa Barbara interviewed over 400 witnesses across 13 months. Neither returned an indictment, which meant there could be no criminal trial. A civil settlement was reached in January 1994 for roughly $23 million, paid by Jackson's insurer, and his legal team maintained for the rest of his life that it was a strategic decision to end a situation destroying him personally and professionally, not an admission of guilt. His critics countered that innocent men rarely pay that kind of money. Both arguments have been made for 3 decades, and neither side has ever produced anything close to a final answer. For nearly a decade after that settlement, Jackson lived under a cloud that never fully lifted. And then, in February 2003, a British documentary called Living with Michael Jackson aired, featuring a scene where Jackson, holding hands on camera with a 13-year-old cancer patient named Gavin Arvizo, said he saw nothing wrong with the boy sleeping in his bedroom. He meant it, by every account, innocently. It did not land that way. Within months, the Arvizo family alleged abuse, and on November 18, 2003, roughly 70 sheriff's deputies raided Neverland Ranch. Jackson turned himself in 2 days later. The booking photo, his expression somewhere between defiance and dissociation, was broadcast to every television screen on Earth. The trial, People versus Jackson, began in January 2005, and the prosecution's case fell apart methodically over months. Gavin Arvizo's mother was shown to have a documented history of false claims, including a prior fraudulent allegation against a security guard, Macaulay Culkin, one of Jackson's closest childhood companions and someone prosecutors hoped to use as evidence of a pattern, testified under oath that nothing had ever happened to him. On June 13, 2005, the jury returned not guilty on all 14 counts, unanimously. Outside the courthouse, thousands of fans erupted. Inside, and according to people who were with him, Jackson was hollowed out. The acquittal was total. It didn't matter. The trial had cost him nearly 2 years of his life, tens of millions of dollars, and by some accounts, he'd entered the courtroom weighing under 120 pounds, unable to eat, unable to sleep without pharmaceutical help. He left the United States almost immediately, spending the next several years drifting between Bahrain, Ireland, and rented properties across Europe. A man acquitted of everything and unable to go home. Neverland, the place he'd built as a sanctuary, had been raided and photographed and picked apart by every tabloid on the planet, and he'd never live there again. And by 2007, his debt had reportedly climbed to somewhere around $500 million, an almost incomprehensible number built from decades of Neverland's upkeep. Legal defense costs from 2 separate sets of allegations, and hundreds of millions borrowed against his stake in the Sony-ATV catalog at punishing interest rates. He was one of the wealthiest people alive on paper and functionally insolvent in practice. The catalog worth billions was also the only collateral keeping his creditors at bay. It was into that desperation that the comeback deal arrived. In March 2009, Jackson announced this is it, a run of concerts at London's O2 Arena that started at 10 shows and, within days, expanded to 50, generating roughly $85 million in advance ticket sales before a single note had been performed. For the promoter AEG, a successful run meant hundreds of millions. For Jackson, it meant either a path out of total financial ruin, or if his body couldn't survive it, nothing left at all. Behind the scenes, from the very start, it was going badly. AEG's own CEO would later testify under oath about finding Jackson locked in his room, unable to be coaxed into getting dressed for his own announcement. Rehearsals that spring showed flashes of the old genius on good days, and on bad days showed a man who was cold when the room was warm, who trembled, who couldn't remember choreography he'd performed thousands of times, who was losing weight steadily and sleeping almost not at all. 6 days before his death, the show's director emailed AEG's leadership describing Jackson as lost and incoherent at rehearsal, cold to the touch, showing strong signs of paranoia and anxiety, and recommending a psychiatrist evaluate him immediately. AEG's response was to shut that concern down and defer entirely to the medical judgment of Jackson's personal physician instead. That physician was Dr. Conrad Murray, cardiologist with a defaulted mortgage, a 2002 bankruptcy, and no training in anesthesiology, sleep medicine, or pain management, hired at $150,000 a month under a contract that gave AEG the power to cancel the arrangement if the concerts didn't happen. That structure meant the doctor's income depended directly on his patient being well enough to perform, an arrangement experts would later call an outright conflict of interest. For years by that point, Jackson had been dealing with chronic, debilitating insomnia, and during the 1996 to 1997 history tour, he'd begun using propofol, a powerful intravenous anesthetic meant strictly for hospital surgical settings. just to get any kind of rest at all. It wasn't sleep in any real medical sense. It suppressed REM cycles almost entirely, offering unconsciousness without actual rest. And an expert who testified years later estimated Jackson may have gone as long as 60 days without real REM sleep before his death. On June 25, 2009, Conrad Murray administered a dose of propofol to help Jackson sleep. Then, according to trial testimony, left the room. Jackson stopped breathing. By the time paramedics arrived, resuscitation efforts failed, and he was pronounced dead at UCLA Medical Center that afternoon at 50 years old. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled the death a homicide, caused by acute propofol intoxication. Conrad Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter, tried in 2011, and convicted, sentenced to 4 years, of which he served roughly 2. He lost his medical license permanently. But the coroner's homicide ruling and a single doctor's manslaughter conviction never fully closed the case in the eyes of the people who loved Jackson most. AEG was sued by Jackson's family in a wrongful death case that went to trial in 2013, with the argument that the company had effectively enabled, or at minimum ignored, warning signs about the very doctor whose contract they'd structured and financed. A jury ultimately found in AEG's favor, ruling that while the company had hired Murray, it wasn't proven that hiring him made him unfit for the job in a way AEG should have known. That verdict satisfied almost nobody who had actually followed the case closely. And the story didn't stay buried either. In 2019, the documentary Leaving Neverland revived the entire conversation around the earlier allegations through new, deeply detailed accounts from 2 men who, as children, had once testified in Jackson's defense and later said that testimony had been false. And more recently, Jackson's name has resurfaced again, this time inside the files connected to Jeffrey Epstein, reigniting a wave of public questions that, once again, mostly go unanswered because the people who could answer them, Jackson included, are gone. So here's where the mystery actually sits, and it's worth being honest about it rather than pretending there's a tidy resolution. The coroner said homicide. A jury convicted 1 doctor of manslaughter. AEG was cleared by a separate jury of any deeper responsibility. The 1993 and 2005 allegations were never proven and never definitively disproven either, and both outcomes have been argued in good faith for over 30 years by people who studied the same evidence and reached completely opposite conclusions. Michael Jackson built the modern music video, integrated MTV, transformed the Super Bowl, sold more records than any solo artist alive, and became, by any real measure, the single most famous human being on the planet. And he also spent the final years of his life underweight, sleep-deprived, financially cornered, and telling the people closest to him that someone was going to kill him for what he owned. Whatever actually happened inside that bedroom on June 25, 2009, the machine that made him also, by nearly every honest account, helped finish him. So, what do you think actually happened here? Do you think Conrad Murray was a scapegoat for a much bigger, much more calculated financial machine that needed Jackson on that stage, no matter the cost? Or do you think, whatever the systemic pressure around him, the responsibility for that night ultimately does start and end with the one man in the room? And on the earlier allegations, where do you personally land after hearing both sides laid out? Let me know in the comments, seriously. I read every single one of them on these deep dives. If you want more of these full life and death breakdowns, make sure you're subscribed, because I've got a lot more of these lined up. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.